The most dangerous stories in Hollywood are never the loud ones. Never the screaming headlines or the breathless accusations that burn hot and fast before collapsing into dust. The most dangerous stories are the quiet ones, the ones built on years of restraint, self-control, and strategic silence. Because when those stories finally surface, they don't explode, they unravel, and once they start pulling at the threads of public fantasy, nothing looks the same again. This story didn't begin with an affair or a confession or even a rumor. It began with something far more unsettling. A woman who had nothing to gain by speaking and everything to lose, finally choosing to stop protecting a version of reality that the world had grown addicted to believing. For nearly a decade, Amelia Warner existed in the cultural background like a fixed point, an unmoving presence orbiting one of the most scrutinized male celebrities of his generation. She was photographed but rarely heard, mentioned but never quoted, present but deliberately peripheral. In an ecosystem that feeds on emotional volatility, she was calm. In an industry that rewards exposure, she withheld. And because of that, she became something far more powerful than a scandalized spouse. She became a blank canvas. And blank canvases invite projection. People painted their own narratives onto her silence. The naive wife, the long-suffering partner, the oblivious outsider, the woman in denial. None of these stories required evidence. Silence, after all, is easily mistaken for weakness by those who benefit from noise. But silence is not absence. It is containment. And containment, when sustained over years, becomes pressure. The public obsession with Jamie Dornan and Dakota Johnson was never really about them as individuals. It was about what they represented. An erotic fantasy that blurred the line between performance and reality. Chemistry so convincing that audiences refused to believe it ended when the camera stopped rolling. This is the unspoken contract of modern celebrity culture. We consume the illusion, then demand that it continue off-screen, as if the actors owe us the consistency of fantasy. And when reality refuses to comply, we assume deception. We assume someone is lying. We assume someone is hiding something. And in this story, for years, the easiest person to doubt was the one who said nothing at all. What no one seemed to consider was the psychological cost of being the only person in the room who sees the full picture while everyone else argues over fragments. Amelia watched the world fall in love with a dynamic that did not belong to them. She watched strangers analyze glances that meant nothing and ignore moments that meant everything. She watched her marriage be reduced to a backdrop, a technicality, an inconvenience to a more exciting narrative. And she understood something most people don't until it's too late. Once the public decides on a story, truth becomes irrelevant. Perception becomes law. This is where the power imbalance begins, not between three individuals, but between private reality and public consumption. Because while Jamie Dornan and Dakota Johnson were elevated, dissected, mythologized, Amelia Warner was quietly erased. Not by hostility, but by assumption. No one asked her what she knew. No one asked her what she felt. They decided for her. And for years, she allowed it, not because she was weak, but because she was protecting something far more fragile than her reputation. The emotional infrastructure of a family that could not survive public correction. That restraint, however, comes at a cost. Every unchallenged narrative calcifies. Every swallowed truth leaves residue. And eventually, silence stops being noble and starts becoming corrosive. When the documentary invitation arrived, it wasn't framed as a confession or an exposé or even a clarification. It was framed as something far more disarming. A conversation about the emotional cost of fame.
No skandal pramist. No akiesaschen simplaid.
Just reflection. And that framing mattered, because Amelia did not enter the conversation as Jamie Dornan's wife. She entered it as a person who had lived inside the consequences of other people's fantasies for years. That distinction is crucial, because the moment you stop defending someone else's image, you begin reclaiming your own. The first shock was not what she said, but how she said it. There was no tremor of outrage, no edge of bitterness, no theatrical pause designed to provoke outrage. There was composure, control. A woman who had already done her emotional reckoning long before the cameras arrived. And that unsettled people far more than any accusation could have. We expect betrayal to sound dramatic. We expect pain to be loud. We do not know what to do with quiet certainty. When she acknowledged the existence of a secret, she didn't weaponize it. She didn't define it. She didn't rush to shape the narrative. She simply confirmed what people had suspected and refused to give them the version they wanted. And in doing so, she exposed something deeply uncomfortable about audience psychology. People don't want truth, they want validation. They want their suspicions rewarded. They want villains and victims neatly assigned. Amelia offered none of that. Instead, she forced the world to sit in ambiguity, and ambiguity is intolerable in an economy built on outrage. The media did what it always does in moments like this. It filled the silence she left behind with speculation, recycled footage, exaggerated interpretations, and emotionally charged headlines that implied far more than they could substantiate. But something had shifted. For the first time, the narrative wasn't being driven by leaks or insiders or anonymous sources. It was being driven by a woman who refused to be baited into emotional exhibitionism. And that restraint reframed everything. Because once you understand that Amelia Warner had always known more than the public, you're forced to confront an uncomfortable question. What does it mean when the person most entitled to feel threatened never acted as if she was? What does it say about the story we've been telling ourselves? This is where the real tension begins. Not between Amelia, Jamie, and Dakota, but between illusion and reality. Between the story that sells and the truth that survives. Because if the connection everyone obsessed over wasn't romantic, wasn't illicit, wasn't a betrayal in the traditional sense, then what was it? And more importantly, why did it provoke such intense speculation for so long? The answer lies in something the public rarely acknowledges. Emotional intimacy is far more destabilizing than physical infidelity. We can rationalize affairs. We can condemn them. We can categorize them. But emotional bonds that exist outside conventional definitions of love threaten our understanding of loyalty itself. They force us to confront the uncomfortable reality that support, understanding, and psychological survival don't always come from the person we expect, or the person society tells us they should. Amelia's calm wasn't denial. It was comprehension. And comprehension is dangerous because it removes the moral high ground from the audience. If she wasn't wronged in the way people assumed, then outrage loses its purpose. Gossip loses its justification. The entire spectacle collapses under the weight of its own assumptions. Jamie Dornan's silence during this period wasn't incidental. It wasn't avoidance. It was alignment. He understood that any attempt to clarify, deny, or contextualize would only feed the machine that had already decided what it wanted from him. Silence, in this case, was not submission, it was refusal. A refusal to simplify something that was never simple. A refusal to turn a human experience into a consumable scandal. And Dakota Johnson's role in this story, largely misunderstood and aggressively misinterpreted, sits at the center of this cultural discomfort. Because she wasn't framed as a person, she was framed as a threat, a disruptor, a temptation. Not because of her actions, but because of what audiences needed her to be to sustain the fantasy. And fantasies require antagonists. What Amelia did, without ever naming names or assigning blame, was remove the antagonist entirely. She reframed the narrative from betrayal to survival, from suspicion to support, from competition to coexistence. And in doing so, she destabilized not just a rumor, but an entire way of consuming celebrity relationships. This is why the reaction was so intense. Not because she confirmed a scandal, but because she denied people the emotional payoff they had been waiting for.
No villain, no confession, no collapse.
Just complexity. And complexity does not trend easily. But this was only the surface revelation. Only the context. Only the invitation to look deeper. Because what Amelia had not yet explained, what she deliberately held back, was why this bond existed, how it formed under pressure, and what it cost her to accept it. And that omission was not accidental. It was strategic. She understood that before people could hear the truth, they needed to unlearn the story they'd been telling themselves. And that truth, when it finally emerged, would challenge not just how we interpret this relationship, but how we define loyalty, strength, and love itself. By the time the second half of Amelia Warner's documentary aired, the world thought it knew what it was waiting for. That assumption alone revealed how little had actually changed. Viewers expected resolution in the familiar sense. Clarification, confirmation, relief. They expected the story to settle into a shape they could recognize and categorize, something they could either condemn or romanticize, something that would finally justify years of speculation. What they were not prepared for was a truth that refused to fit inside the emotional grammar of scandal. Because the reality Amelia began to describe did not resemble betrayal, nor did it resemble innocence. It existed in a far more unsettling territory, one where emotional survival, psychological fracture, and quiet dependency intersected in ways that made traditional judgments feel embarrassingly inadequate. The moment Amelia stated, plainly and without theatrical emphasis, that the secret between Jamie Dornan and Dakota Johnson was not romantic, something subtle but profound happened in the room. Disbelief didn't explode. It stalled. The interviewer didn't interrupt. The audience didn't exhale. There was a brief, suspended silence, the kind that occurs when a long-held assumption collapses and the mind scrambles to rebuild meaning around new information. This was not the denial people were braced for. This was something far more disarming, reframing. To understand what Amelia was revealing, you have to strip away the fantasy scaffolding that surrounded 50 Shades of Grey and look at what that moment represented in real human terms. Overnight, Jamie Dornan went from respected actor to global fixation. His image was no longer his own. His body, his expressions, his private life were rebranded as public property. He was sexualized, criticized, idealized, mocked, and dissected simultaneously. Masculinity itself became a battleground he was expected to perform on demand. Confident but sensitive, dominant B. Dominant but humble, desirable but faithful. There is no psychological training for that kind of contradiction, and there is no safe way through it without collateral damage. Amelia understood this long before the public did because she lived with the fallout. She watched the man she loved be flattened into a symbol that bore only partial resemblance to the person she knew. And while she remained anchored to their private world, children, routines, the slow rhythms of real life, Jamie was being pulled into a parallel reality where everything was louder, faster, and mercilessly performative. This is where the public narrative begins to fracture, because the assumption has always been that the primary emotional support in such moments must come from a spouse. That belief is comforting, romantic, and deeply unrealistic. Dakota Johnson was not entering Jamie's life as an interloper. She was entering it as someone standing in the same storm. She was subjected to the same distortions, the same invasive projections, the same pressure to embody a fantasy she did not create. And unlike the audience, she saw the cost of that transformation up close. Amelia didn't describe this as a friendship in the conventional sense, because friendship is too light a word for what was forming. It was a pact of recognition, a mutual acknowledgement of distress that could not be voiced publicly without being weaponized. This is the part of the story people struggle to hear because it threatens a deeply ingrained belief that emotional exclusivity is the highest proof of loyalty. Amelia dismantled that assumption quietly, not with philosophy, but with lived experience. She explained that what bound Jamie and Dakota was not desire, but containment, the ability to hold pieces of each other that the world refused to treat gently. They were witnesses to each other's unraveling at a time when vulnerability would have been perceived as weakness. The promise Amelia referenced was not dramatic. It was not spoken in grand language. It was simple and therefore profound. Protect each other when the noise becomes unbearable. Do not let the world turn you into something unrecognizable. Do not abandon yourself to the narrative others are writing for you. That kind of promise does not photograph well. It does not trend, but it changes lives. The interviewer's question, "Did you know at the time?" cut closer than it appeared, because embedded within it was the accusation the public had been leveling for years, that Amelia was either unaware or willfully ignorant. Her answer dismantled that insult without raising her voice. She knew. She knew there was a bond. She knew it mattered. And she knew it hurt in ways she could not easily articulate to anyone outside the situation. Knowledge did not spare her pain, complicated it. This is where the emotional center of the story shifts. Amelia did not position herself as a martyr. She admitted the ache of watching her husband share something irreplaceable with another person, even if that thing was not romantic love. Loss does not require infidelity to be real. Grief does not require betrayal to be valid. There is a particular kind of loneliness that emerges when the person you love needs a form of understanding you cannot provide. Not because you are inadequate, but because you are not inside the same experience. What makes this dynamic difficult to accept is that it forces a confrontation with emotional hierarchy. Society prefers clear ranks. Spouse first, everyone else second. But trauma does not respect hierarchy. Pressure does not ask permission. And support arrives where it can, not where it is supposed to. Amelia's strength was not in pretending otherwise, but in recognizing it before resentment hardened into something corrosive. When she revealed that she encouraged Jamie to maintain his connection with Dakota after the films ended, the reaction was predictably polarized. To some, it sounded impossible. To others, performative. To those who have lived through similar emotional terrain, it sounded familiar. Amelia did not frame this decision as altruism. She framed it as realism. She understood that severing a bond formed under intense psychological pressure does not heal wounds. It reopens them. Cutting Dakota out of Jamie's life would not have strengthened their marriage. It would have forced him to bury a chapter of himself that still needed integration. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the story. Amelia did not win by eliminating a perceived rival. She chose to coexist with complexity rather than simplify her marriage into something brittle. And that choice came at a cost the public rarely acknowledges. Forgiveness is not a moment. It is a sustained effort. Acceptance is not passive. It requires continuous emotional labor. Her observation that people confuse love with threat landed quietly, but it carried the weight of lived wisdom. Dakota was never a threat because she was never trying to take anything. She was a mirror, reflecting back parts of Jamie that fame had fractured. And mirrors are dangerous only when we are afraid of what they reveal. Amelia was not afraid of reflection. She was afraid of denial. The moment she articulated that sometimes the person who saves the one you love is not you, something fundamental shifted in the narrative. This was not resignation. It was humility. It was the recognition that love does not entitle us to be everything for someone. It asks us to prioritize their survival over our ego. That idea is deeply unsettling in a culture that equates love with possession. What made this revelation resonate was not its novelty, but its honesty. Amelia did not romanticize the arrangement. She did not suggest it was painless or ideal. She acknowledged the fear, the grief, the internal negotiations that came with it. And then she acknowledged something even harder to admit, that once she stopped fighting the reality of the bond, she stopped suffering as much. Understanding did not erase pain, but it gave it shape. And shaped pain is survivable. By the time the documentary reached its closing moments, it was clear that Amelia was not interested in rewriting history to appear virtuous. She was interested in telling the truth as it was lived. Messy, unresolved, deeply human. The audience reaction reflected that shift. The outrage people had prepared themselves to feel had nowhere to land. There was no betrayal to condemn, no villain to exile, only a story about emotional endurance that refused to flatter anyone involved. And yet, this was not the end of the reckoning. Because while Amelia had clarified the nature of the bond, she had not yet explored its aftermath. She had not spoken about what it meant to live with that knowledge over time, how it reshaped her understanding of marriage, or what it demanded of her identity beyond being someone's wife. The most destabilizing truths were still untouched, because the final chapter of this story is not about Jamie or Dakota at all. It is about what Amelia lost, what she rebuilt, and why her version of love now stands in direct opposition to the fantasy the world once projected onto her life. The most revealing truths are rarely the ones spoken under pressure. They surface later, after the noise has faded, after the audience has moved on to the next fixation, after the moment when outrage or admiration could still be harvested. That is why the final part of Amelia Warner's story never arrived with a headline. It arrived quietly, almost invisibly, embedded in the way she spoke about herself rather than the people around her. Because once the bond between Jamie Dornan and Dakota Johnson had been reframed, once the public had been forced to confront a version of the story that did not satisfy its appetite for scandal, the real question was no longer what happened between the three of them. The real question was what it cost the person who chose to understand rather than resist. For years, Amelia's public identity had been defined by what she was not doing. She was not reacting, not clarifying, not competing, not performing pain for validation. In an environment where emotional display is currency, her restraint was misread as detachment. But restraint is not emotional absence. It is emotional discipline. And discipline, when applied for too long without acknowledgement, can hollow a person out. What Amelia began to describe in the closing reflections of the documentary was not martyrdom, but erosion, the slow, almost imperceptible wearing away of self that occurs when your emotional labor remains invisible. She spoke about the strange loneliness of being praised for strength while quietly longing to be seen as fragile. Strength, in public discourse, is often a euphemism for silence that makes other people comfortable. Amelia was celebrated for not causing trouble, for not disrupting a narrative that benefited everyone but her.